Lucas Sanders had finally found the peace he long sought after years of military service. The suburban house he had recently moved into wasn't just a home, it was a promise of stability, a fresh chapter in his life. Situated at the end of a quiet street, the house came with a decently large yard surrounded by dense trees. Though the property itself was charming, one thing immediately struck Lucas as odd: the absence of a proper boundary between his lot and that of his next-door neighbor, Karen. The previous owner had only left behind a rotting wooden fence, half collapsed in some places and wildly overgrown with weeds in others. Knowing he wanted privacy and security, Lucas quickly made plans to replace the crumbling structure. Lucas had spent the past month overseeing renovations and installing a sturdy new metal fence around his property. The new fence wasn't just a practical solution, it symbolized his desire for a clean slate, a life where he could finally have control over his surroundings. However, it didn't take long for Lucas to realize that peace and quiet might not be so easily achieved, not when he had a neighbor like Karen. From the day she saw workers installing the fence, Karen had made her presence known. She was in her late 50s, with a sharp, judgmental glare and an air of entitlement. The moment she spotted the construction crew, she marched over to Lucas and wasted no time expressing her disapproval. "This fence is too tall. It's blocking the view of my backyard," she complained loudly, folding her arms across her chest. "This isn't the kind of neighborhood for barriers like this." Lucas, still new to the area and not wanting to start off on the wrong foot with his neighbors, tried to remain polite. "It's within the legal height limit, ma'am. I just want a bit more privacy." Karen didn't seem satisfied by his explanation. "Privacy? This is a neighborhood, not a fortress. We don't need people walling themselves off like they're hiding something." Despite her protests, Lucas continued with the installation, ignoring her sour remarks and figuring that, in time, she would get used to it. Little did he know, Karen wasn't someone who simply let things go. Over the following weeks, Karen's passive-aggressive behavior became a constant nuisance. Every time Lucas worked in his yard, he felt her watchful eyes on him. On several occasions, he caught her standing just beyond the fence, muttering under her breath about how some people thought they could come into the neighborhood and do whatever they pleased. Lucas tried to stay above it all, chalking up her behavior to typical nosy neighbor antics. But deep down, he had a feeling that Karen wasn't done causing trouble. One afternoon, Lucas noticed Karen talking animatedly with a group of neighbors at the end of the street. Though he couldn't hear what they were saying, her frequent glances toward his property left little doubt that he was the topic of conversation. The situation began to weigh on Lucas more than he liked to admit. He had faced far greater challenges during his time in the military, yet something about this petty suburban conflict felt uniquely exhausting. All he wanted was to enjoy his new home without unnecessary drama. Then, one evening, things took a more troubling turn. As Lucas was cleaning up after a long day of work in the yard, he noticed Karen pacing along the length of the new fence, holding a tape measure. She appeared to be checking the exact placement of the fence posts. When she caught sight of Lucas watching her, she didn't even bother to hide what she was doing. Instead, she flashed him a smug smile and walked back toward her house without saying a word. Lucas felt his frustration growing but chose not to engage. He figured she was just looking for something to complain about and hoped ignoring her would make her lose interest. Unfortunately, Karen's behavior only escalated from there. Over the next few days, she made several snide remarks whenever Lucas was outside. "That fence doesn't even look straight," she muttered loudly enough for him to hear. Another time, she loudly declared to a passing neighbor, "I miss the open feel we used to have before people started building these ugly barricades," though it annoyed him. Lucas continued to hold his tongue. He wasn't about to be drawn into a petty feud over a perfectly legal fence. Still, the constant negativity made it difficult for him to enjoy his new home as he had hoped. Despite Karen's antics, Lucas pressed forward with his plans to improve the property. He hired landscapers to clean up the yard and planted a few new trees along the fence line. He was determined not to let her ruin his experience. Yet, even as he tried to move on, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that Karen's hostility was more than just neighborly grumbling. There was something about the way she watched him, always with that same calculating expression, that made him think she was waiting for an opportunity to escalate things further. One morning, as Lucas was enjoying his coffee on the back porch, he noticed something strange. A section of the grass near the fence on Karen's side had been dug up, leaving a bare patch of dirt. Though it wasn't immediately clear why she had done this, it struck Lucas as odd. It almost looked like someone had been trying to mark something or prepare the ground for a future project. Whatever her intentions were, he doubted they were anything good. His instincts told him to stay on guard. Lucas knew that trying to reason with Karen was pointless. She clearly thrived on conflict, and any attempt to confront her would likely only make things worse. Instead, he decided to focus on documenting everything. If things ever escalated to the point where he needed to involve the authorities, he wanted to have a clear record of events. Though he hoped it wouldn't come to that, experience had taught him that it was always better to be prepared. Despite his best efforts to maintain a low profile and avoid further conflict, Lucas sensed that Karen wasn't finished with him. The hostility in her gaze, the passive-aggressive remarks, and her strange behavior around the fence all pointed to one thing: this wasn't just about a property boundary. Karen had a deeper motive, and it was only a matter of time before she made her next move. Lucas couldn't help but wonder how far she was willing to go. He had faced many battles in his life, but none quite like this one. This wasn't a war zone with clear enemies and objectives. This was a twisted suburban chess game, and Karen seemed determined to push him into a corner. What she didn't realize, however, was that Lucas wasn't the type to back down. He had faced tougher opponents in his life, and if she thought she could intimidate him into submission, she was in for a rude awakening. Lucas woke up to the sound of metal clanging outside his window. For a moment, he thought it was just the landscapers he had hired earlier in the week, finally getting started on clearing the overgrown sections of his backyard. But something about the noise didn't sit right. It was too chaotic, too harsh. He got out of bed, quickly pulled on a shirt, and headed toward the front yard to see what was happening. As he rounded the corner of the house, his heart sank. Karen stood near the side of his property. A smug expression plastered across her face, as a man with a sledgehammer brought down another heavy blow against his newly built metal fence. The sight of twisted and dented panels lying on the ground sent a surge of anger through Lucas. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. This wasn't just another petty argument or passive-aggressive jab. Karen was outright destroying his property. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Lucas demanded, his voice sharp and incredulous as he strode toward the pair. Karen didn't flinch. In fact, she seemed to revel in the confrontation, her lips curling into a sneer as she turned to face him. "Fixing your little mistake," she said coolly. "This fence is on my property, and I have every right to remove it." Lucas's eyes flicked to the man with the sledgehammer, who hesitated mid-swing, clearly unsure whether to keep going or back off. "Stop," Lucas ordered, his voice steady but filled with authority. The man lowered the sledgehammer but didn't leave, glancing nervously between Lucas and Karen. "This fence isn't on your property," Karen, Lucas said firmly, trying to keep his temper in check. "I had a surveyor mark the boundaries before I installed it. Everything was done legally." Karen crossed her arms, her expression hardening. "Oh please, I've lived here for over 20 years. I know exactly where my property ends, and your fence crosses well over the line. You can wave your little surveyor's papers around all you want, but that doesn't change the fact that you're trespassing." Lucas opened his mouth to argue further, but before he could say another word, Karen pulled out her phone and started dialing. "Fine," she said loudly, making sure he heard every word. "Since you're not willing to do the right thing and take down your illegal fence, I'll let the police handle it." Lucas couldn't believe what he was hearing. She was the one tearing down his fence, and now she was calling the police on him? The sheer audacity left him momentarily speechless. He watched as Karen stepped a few feet away, speaking animatedly into the phone, likely embellishing the situation to make herself look like the victim. "Listen," Lucas said, turning his attention to the man with the sledgehammer. "I don't know who you are, but if you don't want to get caught up in something you'll regret, I suggest you leave. Now." The man hesitated for a moment, clearly weighing his options. He glanced at Karen, who was still on the phone, then back at Lucas. Deciding he didn't want to be part of whatever mess this was turning into, he slung the sledgehammer over his shoulder and walked away without a word. Lucas felt a small sense of relief, but it was quickly overshadowed by the sight of Karen finishing her call and strutting back toward him with a self-satisfied smirk. "They'll be here soon," she said smugly. "Let's see what they have to say about your little fence." Lucas clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but the thought of having to deal with police officers over something so ridiculous was infuriating. Still, he couldn't afford to lose his temper, especially not in front of someone like Karen, who would no doubt use any outburst against him. A few tense minutes later, a patrol car pulled up in front of the house. Two officers stepped out, one of them a tall man with a stern expression leading the way. Karen immediately launched into a dramatic retelling of events, claiming that Lucas had illegally built a fence on her property and was now refusing to remove it. She gestured wildly toward the half-destroyed fence, as if trying to emphasize the supposed violation. The officers listened patiently, nodding occasionally as Karen spoke. When she finally paused to catch her breath, the taller officer turned to Lucas. "Sir, can you tell us your side of the story?" Lucas took a deep breath before responding. "I moved in about a month ago," he began, keeping his tone measured. "Before installing the fence, I hired a licensed surveyor to mark the property boundaries. The fence was built entirely on my side of the line. Karen here," he gestured toward her, "wasn't happy about it, but that doesn't give her the right to destroy my property." He pulled out his phone and quickly located the digital copy of the surveyor's report, handing it over to the officer. "Here's the report, showing the exact boundaries of my property." The officer took the phone and examined the document carefully. After a moment, he handed it back to Lucas with a nod. "This seems pretty clear." "Mom," he said, turning to Karen, "unless you have documentation proving otherwise, it looks like the fence is on his property." Karen's face turned red with frustration. "I don't need documentation," she snapped. "I've lived here for decades. I know where the boundary is. That fence shouldn't be there, and it needs to come down." The officer remained calm, but firm. "Without proper documentation, we can't force him to remove the fence. If you believe there's been a mistake, your best option is to file a formal property dispute with the county. Until then, you're not allowed to damage his property. If you do, you'll be liable for any damages." Karen opened her mouth to argue further but seemed to think better of it. Instead, she crossed her arms and glared at Lucas. "This isn't over," she muttered under her breath before storming back toward her house. The officers stayed for a few more minutes, making sure the situation was fully de-escalated before leaving. Lucas thanked them for their time and watched as the patrol car drove off, feeling a mixture of relief and lingering frustration. He knew Karen wasn't bluffing. She would find another way to escalate the situation. And sure enough, later that evening, he noticed something strange. A bright orange stake had been driven into the ground near the edge of his property, with a handwritten sign attached to it. The sign read, "Property line fence must be removed." Lucas could only shake his head in disbelief. Karen wasn't going to back down, and it was clear she was gearing up for a long, drawn-out fight. He would have to be ready for whatever she tried next. Later that night, Lucas stood by his kitchen window, staring out at the newly damaged section of his fence. The light from his porch cast long shadows across the yard, highlighting the crumpled metal panels and the patch of dirt where Karen's hired worker had taken a sledgehammer to the posts. His frustration hadn't diminished since the officers left. He replayed the encounter in his mind, wondering what Karen's next move would be. Something told him that today's incident was just the beginning. People like Karen didn't let things go easily, especially when they had a personal vendetta. Lucas knew he couldn't leave things as they were. Letting her destroy his property without consequences would only embolden her to escalate further. She had already proved she was willing to bend the truth and manipulate the situation to her advantage. What was stopping her from trying something worse? If he didn't take action soon, he risked being dragged into an even more exhausting and costly conflict. It wasn't just about the fence anymore, it was about making it clear that he wouldn't be bullied. The next morning, Lucas contacted the contractor who had installed the fence. He explained the situation and asked for an estimate to repair the damage. The contractor agreed to come by later in the day to assess the costs. As he hung up the phone, Lucas noticed movement near the edge of his property. Karen was outside, pacing along the fence line again, this time with a clipboard in hand. She appeared to be taking notes, occasionally glancing up at his house, as if daring him to confront her. Lucas ignored her and went about his day, deciding not to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. However, as the morning wore on, he noticed that Karen wasn't alone. A small group of neighbors had gathered near her driveway, and she was animatedly gesturing toward his property, speaking loudly enough that snippets of her conversation carried over to his yard. Completely disregarded the character of the neighborhood. Ruining the view for everyone. Won't even admit he's in the wrong. Lucas felt a knot of irritation tightening in his chest. He didn't know many of the neighbors yet, but the last thing he wanted was to be painted as some kind of disruptive outsider. He considered walking over to clear things up, but decided against it. Engaging Karen in front of an audience would only play into her hands. Instead, he focused on documenting everything. He took several photos of the damaged fence, ensuring that the time and date were recorded, and made notes about the incident with the police. If Karen continued her harassment, he wanted to have a clear record of her actions. By the time the contractor arrived that afternoon, Karen had retreated back into her house, though Lucas noticed her peeking through the curtains as the contractor inspected the damage. Looks like someone took a pretty serious swing at this. The contractor said, shaking his head as he examined the bent and broken panels, "We can replace the damaged sections, but it's not going to be cheap." Lucas nodded, already expecting that answer. "Go ahead and send me the estimate. I want to get this taken care of as soon as possible." As the contractor left, Lucas glanced back toward Karen's house. The curtain in her window twitched slightly, confirming that she had been watching the entire time. He could almost feel her smug satisfaction radiating from across the yard. She likely thought she had scored a victory by forcing him to spend more money on repairs. But Lucas wasn't about to let her intimidate him into backing down. If she wanted to play games, he would be ready. The following day, Lucas received a letter in the mail. The envelope was unmarked, with no return address, but the handwriting on the front was unmistakably Karen's. He opened it cautiously, half expecting some kind of formal complaint. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a hastily scrawled message: "Your fence is an eyesore. Remove it or face legal action." Lucas stared at the note for a long moment, torn between disbelief and annoyance. The audacity of Karen's demand was almost laughable, but it also confirmed that she was serious about pursuing this ridiculous feud. He considered throwing the note away, but ultimately decided to keep it as further evidence of her harassment. If she followed through on her threat to take legal action, he wanted to be prepared. That evening, as Lucas was working in his garage, he heard voices outside. He stepped out onto his driveway and saw Karen speaking with two other neighbors. One of them, a middle-aged man Lucas hadn't met before, seemed hesitant, while the other, a woman in her 50s, nodded along enthusiastically as Karen spoke. Though he couldn't make out the details of their conversation, it was clear that Karen was continuing her campaign to turn the neighborhood against him. Lucas took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. He reminded himself that he didn't need to win over everyone, just enough people to prevent Karen from rallying a mob against him. With that in mind, he decided it was time to introduce himself properly to some of the other neighbors. Over the next few days, he made an effort to greet people when he saw them outside, striking up small conversations and getting to know them. He quickly learned that Karen had a reputation for being difficult. Several neighbors hinted at past conflicts, though none of them seemed willing to openly criticize her. "She's passionate about the neighborhood," one neighbor said diplomatically, clearly trying to avoid taking sides. "She means well, but sometimes she can be a bit overbearing," another added, choosing his words carefully. Lucas got the sense that many of the neighbors didn't fully agree with Karen but were wary of crossing her. She had lived in the area for decades and had built up enough influence that people preferred to stay on her good side, even if it meant turning a blind eye to her more questionable behavior. Despite the polite responses he received, Lucas knew he couldn't rely on the neighbors to support him if things escalated further. Karen had spent years cultivating her image as a protector of the neighborhood, and it would take more than a few friendly conversations to undo that. Still, he felt a small sense of satisfaction in knowing that not everyone had bought into her narrative. A few nights later, Lucas was woken by a loud clatter outside. He got out of bed and quickly made his way to the front door, half expecting to find Karen pulling another stunt. Instead, he found his trash cans overturned, with garbage strewn across the driveway. Though it was possible that an animal had caused the mess, the timing felt too coincidental. He cleaned up the mess in silence, his irritation growing with each passing minute. This was exactly the kind of petty harassment he had expected from Karen. The next morning, he decided to take a proactive step. He contacted a local surveyor and requested a fresh assessment of the property boundaries, hoping to put an end to any claims Karen might make about the fence being on her land. The surveyor agreed to come by the following week, giving Lucas a small sense of relief. With an updated survey in hand, he would have indisputable proof that his fence was legally installed. As the days went by, Karen continued her campaign of passive-aggressive harassment. She made loud remarks about selfish neighbors whenever Lucas was within earshot, and on one occasion, she even placed a row of potted plants along the edge of his driveway, claiming they were on her side of the property line. Lucas ignored her antics, focusing instead on preparing for the upcoming survey. He knew that once the surveyor confirmed the boundaries, he would finally have the upper hand. But until then, he had to remain vigilant. Karen wasn't backing down, and Lucas had no doubt that she was already planning her next move. Several days later, the surveyor Lucas had hired finally arrived. It was a cool, overcast morning, and a light breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass through the neighborhood. Lucas was relieved to see the familiar truck pull up in front of his house, the logo of a reputable land survey company emblazoned on the side. He had worked with them before, and he knew they were thorough professionals who wouldn't be easily swayed by external pressure, especially not from someone like Karen. The surveyor, a no-nonsense man in his early 50s named Greg, greeted Lucas with a firm handshake. "Morning, Lucas. So, you mentioned you've been having some boundary disputes with your neighbor." "Yeah," Lucas replied, gesturing toward the partially damaged fence. "She's claiming that my fence crosses onto her property, even though I had the boundaries marked before I moved in. I just need an updated survey to confirm everything, so there's no room for argument." Greg nodded, pulling out a set of blueprints and maps from his truck. "Got it. Let's get started." As Greg began setting up his equipment, Lucas couldn't help but glance over at Karen's house. Sure enough, she was standing at her window, peering out at them with a look of obvious displeasure. A few minutes later, the front door opened, and Karen stepped out, marching purposefully toward the property line. "I hope you're not planning to manipulate those measurements," she said loudly, her voice carrying across the yard. "I have my own records, you know." Greg barely looked up from his equipment, maintaining his calm professionalism. I'm just here to do my job. We'll be following official property records and using precise GPS data. If there's any discrepancy, it'll be documented." Karen crossed her arms, glaring at Lucas. "This won't change anything. That fence is still an eyesore, and it doesn't belong here." Lucas ignored her, choosing not to engage. He knew Karen was trying to provoke him, hoping he would lose his temper in front of the surveyor. Instead, he stood silently by as Greg went about his work, carefully marking the corners of the property and double-checking the existing boundary lines. The process took a little over an hour. Karen stayed outside the entire time, pacing back and forth like a predator circling its prey. At one point, she pulled out her phone and started taking pictures of Greg's equipment, muttering under her breath about biased professionals and backroom deals. Lucas couldn't help but feel a pang of annoyance, but he kept his composure. He knew that reacting to her provocations would only make things worse. Finally, Greg finished his measurements and walked back over to Lucas, clipboard in hand. "Well, it's exactly as you said. The fence is entirely on your property, and there's no encroachment on her side whatsoever. I'll have the official report ready by tomorrow, but you can rest easy, everything checks out." Lucas felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had known all along that he was in the right, but having official confirmation from a professional gave him a renewed sense of confidence. "Thanks, Greg. I appreciate you coming out here on short notice." No problem, Greg replied, packing up his equipment. I'll email you the report as soon as it's ready. As Greg drove off, Lucas turned to see Karen still standing near the property line, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She looked furious, her face flushed with anger. For a moment it seemed like she might storm over and start another argument, but instead, she turned on her heel and marched back into her house without a word. Lucas sighed, knowing that this wasn't the end. Karen wouldn't give up that easily. She had invested too much time and energy into this feud to simply walk away now. Sure enough, later that evening, Lucas found another letter taped to his front door. This one was more formal, written on letterhead from a local law firm. It was a notice of intent to sue, claiming that his fence was causing emotional distress and demanding its immediate removal. Lucas couldn't believe the audacity of it. Emotional distress? Over a perfectly legal fence? It was clear that Karen was grasping at straws, trying to find any excuse to continue the conflict. He scanned the letter carefully, noting the name of the law firm. It wasn't a particularly well-known firm, likely someone Karen had hired at a discount to pursue a frivolous case. Still, a legal threat was a legal threat, and Lucas knew he couldn't afford to take it lightly. The next morning, Lucas met with his lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Rachel, who had helped him with the initial property purchase. He showed her the letter, and after reading it over, she leaned back in her chair with a thoughtful expression. "This is a pretty weak case," Rachel said, tapping the letter with her pen. "They're claiming emotional distress, but there's no concrete basis for that. Emotional distress lawsuits are notoriously hard to win, especially when it involves something as mundane as a fence. However, that doesn't mean we should ignore it. Karen is clearly trying to harass you into taking down the fence, and if we don't respond, she might escalate further." Lucas nodded, grateful for Rachel's level-headed approach. "So what do you recommend?" "We'll send a formal response, refuting her claims and warning her that if she continues this harassment, we'll pursue a counterclaim for damages. That should be enough to make her back off, at least for now." Lucas agreed, feeling reassured by Rachel's confidence. He knew he was in good hands, and with the survey report on his side, he felt more prepared than ever to stand his ground. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't done yet. She had already shown she was willing to go to extreme lengths to get her way, and Lucas doubted a single legal letter would be enough to deter her. Over the next few days, things remained relatively quiet. Karen didn't make any more direct confrontations, and Lucas began to hope that maybe, just maybe, the situation was finally starting to de-escalate. He focused on repairing the damaged section of the fence, hiring a new contractor to finish the job. The work went smoothly, and within a few days the fence was fully restored, looking as good as new. But just when Lucas thought the worst was behind him, he received an unexpected visit. Late one afternoon, a car pulled up in front of his house, and two men in suits stepped out. They introduced themselves as representatives from a local mediation service, claiming that Karen had requested a formal mediation to resolve the dispute. Lucas was taken aback. Mediation? He had never agreed to any such thing, and the idea of sitting down with Karen to discuss the fence seemed absurd. Still, the men explained that while mediation wasn't legally binding, it was often encouraged by local courts as a way to resolve disputes without going to trial. If Lucas refused, it could potentially be used against him if the case ever went to court. Reluctantly, Lucas agreed to attend the mediation, knowing that it was probably just another tactic from Karen to waste his time and energy. He scheduled the meeting for the following week and immediately contacted Rachel to prepare for it. As the date of the mediation approached, Lucas couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. He knew Karen well enough by now to expect that she had something up her sleeve. She wouldn't have requested mediation unless she believed she could gain something from it. Whatever her plan was, Lucas was determined to be ready. On the day of the mediation, Lucas arrived early, accompanied by Rachel. The meeting was held in a neutral office downtown, with a professional mediator presiding over the discussion. Karen was already there when they arrived, seated at the table with her lawyer. She greeted Lucas with a cold, triumphant smile, as if she had already won. The mediator began the session by outlining the rules. Both parties would have a chance to present their concerns, and the goal was to reach a mutually agreeable solution. Karen's lawyer went first, reiterating the same baseless claims about emotional distress and property encroachment. When it was Lucas's turn, Rachel calmly presented the survey report and legal documentation proving that the fence was entirely on his property. Despite the clear evidence in Lucas's favor, Karen continued to argue, becoming increasingly agitated as the session went on. It was clear that she wasn't interested in a fair resolution. She wanted to win, no matter what. Eventually, the mediator called a break, giving both sides time to cool off. As Lucas stepped outside to get some fresh air, he realized something important. This wasn't just about the fence. For Karen, this was personal, a way to assert control over her environment and everyone around her. She wasn't fighting for justice, she was fighting to prove that she could get her way, no matter the cost. Lucas knew then that he couldn't afford to back down. This wasn't just a petty neighborhood dispute anymore, it was a battle of wills, and he was determined to see it through to the end. The mediation ended in deadlock. Despite Lucas's clear evidence and Rachel's steady presentation of facts, Karen refused to budge. Her lawyer proposed unreasonable solutions, including Lucas dismantling the entire fence and sharing the cost of a new one. That would meet Karen's aesthetic preferences. It was obvious that Karen wasn't negotiating in good faith. She was playing for time, hoping to wear Lucas down. As they left the office, Rachel reassured him. "Don't let this get to you. They're bluffing, trying to intimidate you into giving up. Legally, you're in a strong position." Lucas nodded, grateful for her support, but he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Karen wasn't finished. If anything, her failure to force him into compliance would only provoke her further. He had learned enough about her over the past few weeks to know that she thrived on control, and when she couldn't get her way, she escalated. That night, Lucas reviewed everything with Rachel, preparing for the possibility of a full-blown lawsuit. They planned to file a counterclaim if Karen followed through with her threat to sue, citing harassment, property damage, and emotional distress caused by her actions. The goal was simple: show Karen that continuing this fight would cost her far more than it was worth. For a few days after the mediation, things remained oddly quiet. Karen didn't make any more direct confrontations, and Lucas started to wonder if perhaps the failed mediation had finally discouraged her. He continued repairing small sections of his property and tidying up his yard, hoping to return to some semblance of normalcy. But that sense of calm didn't last long. One morning, Lucas was in his backyard clearing out some old debris when he noticed something strange near the fence line. At first glance, it looked like a pile of leaves that had blown in from Karen's yard. But as he approached, he realized it wasn't just leaves. There were large, jagged rocks and bits of broken glass scattered among them, deliberately placed near the base of the fence. Lucas frowned, crouching down for a closer look. This wasn't natural debris. It was a calculated attempt to create a hazard. Shaking his head in frustration, Lucas grabbed a pair of gloves and carefully began clearing away the mess. As he worked, he couldn't help but wonder how far Karen was willing to go. The broken glass was particularly concerning. If he hadn't noticed it in time, it could have seriously injured anyone walking through the yard, especially pets or children. This wasn't just petty harassment anymore, it was reckless endangerment. Lucas documented everything, taking photos of the glass and rocks before disposing of them properly. Once again, he contacted Rachel, explaining what had happened. "We can't prove she put it there," Rachel said, her voice calm but serious. "But it's another incident to add to our case. Keep documenting everything. The more evidence we have, the better." That evening, Lucas decided to install additional security measures around his property. He had already set up a few motion-activated lights and cameras near the front of the house, but now he added more cameras along the fence line, ensuring that every angle was covered. He wasn't about to let Karen get away with another stunt like this. The following day, Lucas woke up to the sound of heavy machinery. He looked out the window and saw a large truck parked on the street in front of Karen's house. Workers were unloading long metal poles and stacks of wooden planks, materials for some kind of construction project. Lucas watched with growing curiosity as they began digging holes along the edge of Karen's yard parallel to his fence. An hour later, Karen emerged from her house, supervising the workers with an air of satisfaction. Lucas couldn't hear what she was saying, but it didn't take a genius to figure out what she was up to. She was building something, perhaps another fence or some kind of structure designed to block his view or make her property look more imposing. Lucas decided not to confront her directly. Instead, he continued about his day, keeping an eye on the construction from a distance. By midday, it became clear what Karen was building: a tall, ugly wooden barrier running the entire length of her property line. Unlike Lucas's sleek metal fence, Karen's barrier was hastily constructed, with uneven planks and mismatched materials. It wasn't just unsightly, it was obviously designed to be an eyesore, a spiteful attempt to provoke him further. Rachel's words echoed in his mind, "Don't let it get to you." He knew that reacting emotionally would only play into Karen's hands. Still, the sight of the crude, makeshift barrier irritated him more than he wanted to admit. It was a petty, childish move, but one that Karen clearly hoped would get under his skin. Later that afternoon, Lucas received a visit from a city inspector. The man introduced himself politely and explained that he was there to check on a complaint regarding unauthorized construction. Lucas immediately understood what was happening. Karen had reported him to the city, likely hoping to cause more trouble by claiming that his fence violated some obscure regulation. The inspector walked around the property, carefully examining the fence and taking notes. Lucas provided him with all the necessary permits and the recent survey report, which clearly showed that everything had been done legally and according to code. After a thorough inspection, the man nodded approvingly. "Everything looks in order here. I'll file my report and close the complaint." "Thanks," Lucas said, relieved but unsurprised. He knew Karen's tactics by now: false complaints, baseless accusations, anything to make his life more difficult. But this time her plan had failed. As the inspector left, Lucas noticed Karen watching from her front porch. She didn't say anything, but the scowl on her face was unmistakable. He could tell she was seething with frustration, angry that her latest attempt to cause trouble had backfired. That night, Lucas sat on his back porch, sipping a cup of coffee as he reflected on the day's events. He knew this wasn't over. Karen wouldn't give up so easily, but he also knew that he was ready for whatever she threw at him next. He had the law on his side, and with Rachel's help, he was prepared to take this fight as far as it needed to go. As the sun set and darkness settled over the neighborhood, Lucas felt a renewed sense of determination. He had come to this quiet suburban street seeking peace and stability, and he wasn't about to let someone like Karen take that away from him. This wasn't just about a fence anymore. It was about standing his ground, protecting what was his, and showing Karen that she couldn't bully him into submission. The next morning, Lucas woke up to an email from Rachel. Attached was a draft of the counterclaim they were preparing to file, detailing every incident of harassment and property damage caused by Karen. As he read through the document, Lucas felt a sense of satisfaction. The evidence was clear, the case was strong, and soon Karen would have to answer for her actions in court. It wasn't the resolution he had hoped for when he first moved in, but it was the one he was ready to fight for. And this time, he wouldn't be fighting alone. The legal wheels began turning faster than Lucas had anticipated. Within a few days of Rachel filing the counterclaim, Karen received an official notice that she was being sued for harassment, property damage, and reckless endangerment. For a moment, Lucas thought this might finally bring her to her senses, that faced with a legitimate legal battle, she would back off and cut her losses. But if Karen was anything, it was stubborn. Instead of retreating, she doubled down. The day after receiving the notice, Karen did something Lucas hadn't expected. She took down her crude wooden barrier. At first, Lucas felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps this was a sign that she was ready to stop the madness. But that hope was short-lived. By the next morning, construction had resumed on her property, this time with a much larger crew. The sound of power tools and heavy machinery filled the air as workers began erecting what looked like a permanent wooden structure along the property line. Lucas tried to ignore it, but it was hard to concentrate on anything with the constant noise and the looming presence of Karen's latest project just a few feet from his yard. By noon, he had seen enough. He called Rachel and explained what was happening. "It sounds like she's trying to create a new point of contention," Rachel said thoughtfully. She probably knows she's in a weak position with the current lawsuit, so she's building something she can claim is legitimate, something that might complicate things for us. Should I call the city again? Lucas asked, feeling a mix of frustration and exhaustion. Not yet, Rachel advised. Let's wait until we have more information. If she's violating any building codes, we can report her later. For now, just document everything. Taking Rachel's advice to heart, Lucas spent the next few hours recording video footage of the construction and taking detailed notes. He also installed a new camera near the property line to capture every angle of Karen's activities. If she was trying to create more chaos, he wanted to be ready with solid evidence. Later that evening, as the noise finally died down, Lucas sat on his porch, watching the last rays of sunlight fade behind the trees. The day had been long and stressful, but he was determined not to let Karen get under his skin. He had come too far to give up now. As he sat there, lost in thought, he noticed something strange. A faint glow was coming from Karen's yard, just beyond the property line. Curious, Lucas got up and walked closer to the fence. Peering through a gap in the slats, he saw a series of newly installed floodlights positioned to shine directly into his backyard. The lights were blinding, casting harsh, artificial brightness over his entire property. Lucas clenched his jaw, anger simmering beneath the surface. This was clearly another deliberate provocation. She wasn't content with just building a new structure, now she wanted to invade his space with light, making it impossible for him to enjoy his own yard in peace. The next morning, Lucas contacted Rachel again and updated her on the situation. "This is getting ridiculous," he said. "She's building something that looks like a permanent barrier, and now she's got floodlights aimed at my yard. It's like she's trying to create a hostile environment." Rachel listened carefully before responding. "Okay, we've got enough to take action. I'll file a request for an emergency injunction to stop her construction and have those lights removed. It's clear she's doing this out of spite, and with the evidence you've collected, we have a good chance of getting the court to intervene." Lucas felt a surge of relief at her words. Finally, they were taking the fight directly to Karen, and this time there would be real consequences for her behavior. The following day, Rachel submitted the request for an injunction, and within 48 hours they had a hearing scheduled. Lucas arrived at the courthouse feeling a mixture of nerves and determination. He had never wanted things to escalate this far, but now that they had, he was ready to see it through to the end. Karen showed up with her lawyer, her expression as smug as ever. She didn't seem the least bit concerned, as if she believed she could talk her way out of anything. But as the hearing began, it quickly became clear that this wasn't going to go her way. Rachel presented a compelling case, showing the judge photos, videos, and copies of the police reports from previous incidents. She argued that Karen's actions were part of a sustained campaign of harassment designed to intimidate and provoke Lucas. When she showed the video footage of the floodlights being turned on late at night, the judge frowned, clearly unimpressed by Karen's tactics. Karen's lawyer tried to argue that the floodlights were for security purposes and that the construction was perfectly legal. But Rachel was ready for this. She pointed out that the lights were angled specifically to shine into Lucas's yard, not Karen's, and that the sudden removal of the wooden barrier and replacement with a more permanent structure suggested malicious intent. After hearing both sides, the judge didn't take long to make a decision. "I'm granting the request for an injunction," he said firmly. "Ms. Peterson, you are hereby ordered to cease all construction on your property until further notice. Additionally, the floodlights must be removed within 24 hours, or you will face fines for non-compliance." Lucas felt a wave of satisfaction as he listened to the judge's ruling. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, he felt like justice was finally being served. Karen, on the other hand, looked furious. Her smug demeanor had vanished, replaced by a scowl as she whispered heatedly to her lawyer. As they left the courtroom, Rachel turned to Lucas with a triumphant smile. "That went about as well as we could have hoped. She's been put on notice. If she tries anything else, we'll be ready." Lucas nodded, grateful for her support. "Thanks, Rachel, I couldn't have done this without you." That evening, Lucas returned home feeling a renewed sense of peace. The floodlights were gone by the following morning, and the construction crew didn't return. For the first time in weeks, his yard felt like his own again. He knew that the legal battle wasn't over yet. Karen would likely try to fight the injunction or find another way to cause trouble. But for now, he could finally breathe a little easier. As he sat on his porch, watching the sunset in silence, Lucas reflected on how far things had come. He had moved to this neighborhood seeking peace and stability, and though Karen had tried her best to disrupt that, she hadn't succeeded. He had stood his ground, fought back with the help of people he trusted, and come out stronger on the other side. There would be more battles ahead, he had no doubt about that, but now he was ready. And no matter what Karen tried next, Lucas knew he wouldn't be fighting alone. In the days following the court's decision, the neighborhood seemed unusually quiet. The floodlights were gone, and the halted construction on Karen's property left an awkward, half-finished wooden frame standing like a monument to her failed campaign against Lucas. Though the injunction had brought a temporary end to her antics, Lucas wasn't naive. He knew this wasn't the final chapter. Karen wasn't someone who gave up easily, and her bruised pride only meant she was likely plotting her next move. But for now, Lucas allowed himself to enjoy the calm. He spent the next few days repairing his yard and finishing the landscaping that had been put on hold for weeks due to Karen's provocations. As he worked, a few neighbors stopped by, offering cautious but friendly greetings. It was clear that word of the court ruling had spread, and people were beginning to view Lucas in a more positive light. Though many of them still seemed wary of openly siding against Karen, the air of tension that had lingered over the neighborhood for weeks was finally starting to lift. One afternoon, as Lucas was trimming the hedges near the fence, he noticed a familiar figure walking toward him. Martha, an older woman who lived a few houses down. Lucas had spoken to her briefly during his earlier efforts to get to know the neighbors, and she had always struck him as someone who kept to herself. "I heard about what happened in court," Martha said, stopping just outside his gate. "Karen's been causing trouble around here for years, but no one's ever managed to stand up to her like you did." Lucas set down his tools and wiped the sweat from his brow. "I didn't have much of a choice. She wasn't going to stop until she got her way." Martha nodded, a hint of a smile on her lips. "Most people around here just try to keep their heads down and avoid getting involved. But sometimes that only makes people like Karen worse. Maybe now she'll finally realize she can't push everyone around." Lucas appreciated her words. It wasn't exactly a public show of support, but it was a small acknowledgement that he wasn't alone in this fight. As Martha walked away, he couldn't help but wonder how many other neighbors had silently endured Karen's behavior over the years, too afraid or unwilling to confront her. The following week, Lucas received an unexpected letter from Karen's lawyer. To his surprise, it wasn't another legal threat. It was a notice informing him that Karen had agreed to settle the ongoing lawsuit. She would pay for the damages to his fence and cover a portion of his legal fees in exchange for dropping the harassment counterclaim. Lucas was initially suspicious, but after consulting with Rachel, he realized that Karen must have finally accepted defeat. With the injunction still in place and the mounting legal costs likely weighing on her, she had little choice but to back down. "Looks like she's waving the white flag," Rachel said over the phone. "It's a fair settlement, and honestly it saves you the hassle of dragging this out any longer. If you're okay with it, I recommend accepting." Lucas agreed. He wasn't interested in prolonging the conflict any more than necessary. After months of dealing with Karen's harassment, he was ready to move on with his life. He signed the settlement papers, and just like that, the legal battle that had consumed so much of his time and energy finally came to an end. But the story didn't end there. A few days after the settlement was finalized, Lucas noticed a moving truck parked in front of Karen's house. He watched from his porch as workers loaded boxes and furniture into the truck, while Karen stood on the sidewalk, barking instructions at them. Though she didn't acknowledge Lucas directly, he could sense her frustration. Whether it was the mounting legal expenses, the loss of her reputation in the neighborhood, or simply the embarrassment of losing the battle she had started, something had driven her to leave. By the end of the day, the truck was gone, and so was Karen. For the first time since Lucas had moved in, the street felt truly peaceful. That evening, Lucas invited a few of the neighbors over for a small gathering in his backyard. It wasn't anything fancy, just a casual get-together to celebrate the end of the ordeal and to finally build some positive relationships in the neighborhood. Martha came, along with a few others who had kept their distance during the conflict. They shared stories, laughed, and for the first time, Lucas felt like he was truly part of the community. As the sun set and the neighbors began to head home, Lucas stood alone in his yard, taking in the quiet night. The fence stood tall and unbroken, a symbol of everything he had endured and overcome. He thought back to when he first moved in, how he had hoped for a fresh start and a peaceful life. While things hadn't gone exactly as planned, he had gained something even more valuable, a sense of resilience and the knowledge that standing up for himself had been worth it. Lucas knew that life would continue to throw challenges his way, but now he was confident that he could face them head-on. The neighborhood was finally his home, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a deep sense of peace. And as he turned to head back inside, he couldn't help but smile. Karen was gone. The battle was over, and he had won not just in court, but in reclaiming the life he had worked so hard to build.